5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello, and welcome to the Fighting Moose Podcast. I'm your host and narrator, Jason Hendrickson. This is a podcast where I retell stories, some fictional and some historical, that can be enjoyed by people of all ages. Here we go again today with the next 4 chapters of The Adventures of Old Mr. Toad, written by Thornton W. Burgess. I think I've said it before, but I really think that I could make a whole podcast just based on stories from Mr. Burgess. He has so many stories, and in my opinion at least, probably John's too, they are very good, and I always enjoy reading them. I hope that you like reading and listening to stories from Mr. Burgess too. Now, let's turn to today's story. I hope you enjoy. Let's begin.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Chapter 9, The Smiling Pool Kindergarten. Play a little, learn a little, grow a little too. That's what every pollywog tries his best to do. Of course, that's what a kindergarten is for, and you may be sure that the babies of Grandfather Frog and Old Mr. Toad and Sticky Toes the Tree Toad did all of these things in the kindergarten of the Smiling Pool. They looked considerably alike, did these little cousins, for they were all pollywogs to begin with. Peter Rabbit came over every day to watch them. Always he had thought pollywogs just homely wriggling things, not the least bit interesting, but since he had discovered how proud of them were Grandfather Frog and Old Mr. Toad, he had begun to wonder about them and then to watch them. There's one thing about them, and that is they are not in danger the way any babies are, said Peter, talking to himself, as is his way when there's no one else to talk to. Just then, a funny little black pollywog wriggled into sight, and while Peter was watching him, a stout-jawed water beetle suddenly rushed from among the water grass, seized the pollywog by his tail, and dragged him down. Peter stared. Could it be that that ugly-looking bug was as dangerous an enemy to the baby toad as Reddy Fox is to a baby rabbit? He began to suspect so, and a little later he knew so, for there was that same little pollywog trying hard to swim and making bad work of it because he had lost half of his long tail. That set Peter to watching sharper than ever, and presently he discovered that pollywogs have to keep their eyes open quite as much as do baby rabbits, if they would live to grow up. There were several kinds of queer, ugly-looking bugs forever darting out at the wriggling pollywogs. Hungry-looking fish lay in wait for them, and Longlegs the Blue Heron seemed to have a special liking for them. But the pollywogs were spry, and seemed to have learned to watch out. They seemed to Peter to spend all their time swimming and eating and growing. They grew so fast that it seemed to him that he could almost see them grow. And just imagine how surprised Peter was to discover one day that that very pollywog which he had seen lose his tail had grown a new one. That puzzled Peter more than anything he had seen in a long time. "Why, I couldn't do that," he exclaimed right out loud. "Do what?" demanded Jerry Muskrat, who happened along just then. "Why, grow a new tail like that pollywog," replied Peter, and told Jerry all that he had seen. Jerry laughed. "You'll see queerer things than that if you watch those pollywogs long enough," said he. "They are a queer lot of babies, and very interesting to watch if you've got the time for it. I haven't. This Smiling Pool is a great kindergarten, and there's something happening here every minute. There's no place like it." "Are those great, big, fat pollywogs Grandfather Frog's children, or Old Mr. Toad's?" asked Peter. "Grandfather Frog's last year's children," replied Jerry. "They'll grow into real frogs this summer if nothing happens to them." "Where are old Mr. Toad's last year's children?" asked Peter. "Don't ask me," replied Jerry. "They hopped away last summer. Never saw anything like the way those toad youngsters grow. Those toad pollywogs you see now will turn into real toads and be leaving the Smiling Pool in a few weeks. People think old Mr. Toad is slow, but there's nothing slow about his children. Look at that little fellow over there. He's begun to grow legs already." Peter looked, and sure enough, there was a pollywog with a pair of legs sprouting out. They were his forelegs, and they certainly did make him look funny. And only a few days before, there hadn't been a sign of legs. "My gracious," exclaimed Peter, "what a funny sight. I thought my babies grew fast, but these beat them." Chapter 10. The Little Toads Start Out to See the World. The world is a wonderful great big place, and in it the young must roam, to learn what their elders have long since learned, that there's never a place like home. It had been some time since Peter Rabbit had visited the Smiling Pool to watch the pollywogs, but one cloudy morning he happened to think of them and decided that he would run over there and see how they were getting along. So off he started, lipperty-lipperty-lip. He wondered if those pollywog children of old Mr. Toad would be much changed. The last time he saw them, some of them had just begun to grow legs, although they still had long tails. He had almost reached the Smiling Pool when great big drops of rain began to splash down. And with those first raindrops, something funny happened. Anyway, it seemed funny to Peter. Right away, he was surrounded by tiny little toads. Everywhere he looked, he saw toads, tiny little toads, just like old Mr. Toad, only so tiny that one could have sat comfortably on a 10-cent piece and still had plenty of room. Peter's big eyes grew round with surprise as he stared. Where had they all come from so suddenly? A minute before, he hadn't seen a single one, and now he could hardly move without stepping on one. It really seemed, as if each raindrop turned into a tiny toad the instant it struck the ground. Of course, Peter knew that that couldn't be, but it was very puzzling, and all those little toads were bravely hopping along as if they were bound for some particular place. Peter watched them for a few minutes, then he once more started for the Smiling Pool. On the very bank, whom should he meet but old Mr. Toad? He looked rather thin, and his back was to the Smiling Pool. Yes, sir, he was hopping away from the Smiling Pool where he had been all the spring, singing in the great chorus. Peter was almost as surprised to see him as he had been to see the little toads, but just then he was most interested in those little toads. "Good morning, old Mr. Toad," said Peter in his most polite manner. "Can you tell me where all these little toads came from?" "Certainly," replied old Mr. Toad. "They came from the Smiling Pool, of course. Where do you suppose they came from?" I didn't know. There wasn't one to be seen, and then it began to rain, and right away they were everywhere. It almost seemed as if they had rained down out of the sky." Old Mr. Toad chuckled. "They've got good sense, if I must say it about my own children," said he. "They know that wet weather is the only weather for toads to travel in. They left the Smiling Pool in the night while it was damp and comfortable, and then, when the sun came up, they hid, like sensible children, under anything they could find, sticks, stones, pieces of bark, grass. The minute this shower came up, they knew it was good traveling weather, and out they popped." "But what did they leave the Smiling Pool for?" Peter asked. "To see the great world," replied old Mr. Toad. "Foolish, very foolish of them, but they would do it. I did the same thing myself when I was their age. Couldn't stop me any more than I could stop them. They don't know when they're well off, but young folks never do. Fine weather, isn't it?" Chapter 11. Old Mr. Toad's Queer Tongue. Old Mother Nature doth provide for all her children large and small. Her wisdom foresees all their needs and makes provision for them all. If you don't believe it, just go ask old Mr. Toad, as Peter Rabbit did, how such a slow-moving fellow as he can catch enough bugs and insects to keep him alive. Perhaps you'll learn something just as Peter did. Peter and old Mr. Toad sat in the rain watching the tiny toads, who, you know, were Mr. Toad's children, leaving their kindergarten in the Smiling Pool and starting out to see the great world. When the last little toad had passed them, old Mr. Toad suddenly remembered that he was hungry, very hungry indeed. "Didn't have time to eat much while I was in the Smiling Pool," he explained. "Couldn't eat and sing too, and while I was down there, I was supposed to sing. Now that it is time to quit singing, I begin to realize that I've got a stomach to look out for as well as a voice. See that bug over there on that leaf? Watch him." Peter looked, and sure enough, there was a fat bug crawling along on an old leaf. He was about 2 inches away from old Mr. Toad, and he was crawling very fast. And right while Peter was looking at him, he disappeared. Peter turned to look at old Mr. Toad. He hadn't budged. He was sitting exactly where he had been sitting all the time, but he was smacking his lips, and there was a twinkle of satisfaction in his eyes. Peter opened his eyes very wide. Wha, he began. "Nice bug," interrupted old Mr. Toad. "Nicest bug I've eaten for a long time." "But I didn't see you catch him," protested Peter, looking at old Mr. Toad as if he suspected him of joking. "Anything wrong with your eyes?" inquired old Mr. Toad. "No," replied Peter, just a wee bit crossly. "My eyes are just as good as ever." "Then watch me catch that fly over yonder," said old Mr. Toad. He hopped towards a fly which had lighted on a blade of grass just ahead. About 2 inches from it, he stopped, and so far as Peter could see, he sat perfectly still. But the fly disappeared, and it wasn't because it flew away either. Peter was sure of that. As he told Mrs. Peter about it afterwards, it was there, and then it wasn't, and that was all there was to it. Old Mr. Toad chuckled. "Didn't you see that one go, Peter?" he asked. Peter shook his head. "I wish you would stop fooling me," said Peter. "The joke is on me, but now you've had your laugh at my expense. I wish you would tell me how you do it, please, Mr. Toad." Now, when Peter said please that way, of course old Mr. Toad couldn't resist him. Nobody could. "Here comes an ant this way. Now you watch my mouth instead of the ant and see what happens," said old Mr. Toad. Peter looked and saw a big black ant coming. Then he kept his eyes on old Mr. Toad's mouth. Suddenly, there was a little flash of red from it, so tiny and so quick that Peter couldn't be absolutely sure that he saw it. But when he looked for the ant, it was nowhere to be seen. Peter looked at old Mr. Toad very hard. "Do you mean to tell me, Mr. Toad, that you've got a tongue long enough to reach way over there where the ant was?" he asked. Old Mr. Toad chuckled again. With every insect swallowed, he felt better-natured. "You've guessed it, Peter," said he. "Handy tongue, isn't it?" "I think it's a very queer tongue," retorted Peter, "and I don't understand it at all. If it's so long as all that, where do you keep it when it isn't in use? I should think you'd have to swallow it to get it out of the way, or else leave it hanging out of your mouth." "Ha ha ha ha!" laughed old Mr. Toad. "My tongue never is in the way, and it's the handiest tongue in the world. I'll show it to you." Chapter 12. Old Mr. Toad Shows His Tongue. To show one's tongue, as you well know, is not considered nice to do. But if it were like Mr. Toad's, I'd want to show it, wouldn't you? I'm quite sure you would. You see, if it were like old Mr. Toad's, it would be such a wonderful tongue that I suspect you would want everybody else to see it. Old Mr. Toad thinks his tongue the most satisfactory tongue in the world. In fact, he is quite sure that without it, he couldn't get along at all, and I don't know as he could. And yet very few of his neighbors know anything about that tongue and how different it is from most other tongues. Peter Rabbit didn't until old Mr. Toad showed him after Peter had puzzled and puzzled over the mysterious way in which bugs and flies disappeared whenever they happened to come within 2 inches or less of old Mr. Toad. What Peter couldn't understand was what old Mr. Toad did with a tongue that would reach 2 inches beyond his mouth. He said as much. "I'll show you my tongue, and then you'll wish you had one just like it," said old Mr. Toad with a twinkle in his eyes. He opened his big mouth and slowly ran his tongue out its full length. Why, exclaimed Peter, "it's fastened at the wrong end." "No such thing," replied old Mr. Toad indignantly. "If it was fastened at the other end, how could I run it out so far?" "But mine and all of the tongues that I have ever seen are fastened way down in the throat," protested Peter. "Yours is fastened at the other end, way in the very front of your mouth. I never heard of such a thing." "There are a great many things you have never heard of, Peter Rabbit," replied old Mr. Toad dryly. "Mine is the right way to have a tongue. Because it is fastened way up in the front of my mouth, that way I can use the whole of it. You see, it goes out its full length. Then, when I draw it in with a bug on the end of it, I just turn it over so that the end that was way out goes way back in my throat and takes the bug with it to just the right place to swallow." Peter thought this over for a few minutes before he ventured another question. "I begin to understand," said he, "but how do you hold on to the bug with your tongue?" "My tongue's sticky, of course, Mr. Stupid," replied old Mr. Toad, looking very much disgusted. "Just let me touch a bug with it, and he's mine every time." Peter thought this over. Then he felt of his own tongue. "Mine isn't sticky," said he very innocently. Old Mr. Toad laughed right out. "Perhaps if it was, you couldn't ask so many questions," said he. "Now watch me catch that fly." His funny little tongue darted out, and the fly was gone. "It certainly is very handy," said Peter politely. "I think we are going to have some more rain, and I'd better be getting back to the dear old briar patch. Very much obliged to you, Mr. Toad. I think you are very wonderful." "Not at all," replied old Mr. Toad. "I've simply got the things I need in order to live, just as you have the things you need. I couldn't get along with your kind of a tongue, but no more could you get along with mine. If you live long enough, you will learn that old Mother Nature makes no mistakes. She gives each of us what we need, and each one has different needs."
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fighting Moose Podcast. Please join us next time as we read another exciting story. Today's music was provided by the artist Analog by Nature, and the audio clips were provided from NASA. For more information to download and or listen to audio or materials from all our recordings, or to contact us, please visit www.thefightingmoose.com, or you can follow the links in the show notes. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcast or on iTunes, and tell a friend. Thank you for your patronage, and as always, try and do a random act of kindness every day.
Mission complete, Houston. After serving the world for over 30 years, the space shuttle turned its place in